Fire is never the initial cause of the revolutions. They primarily come to rest on the fear of the people, the fear of starvation, the fear of hunger, fear of collapse. And for the France of the 18th century, a fear that the entire kingdom was short on bread, short on cash, and short on time. Good morning, good evening, and good night. Welcome to Steve's Expertise Podcast, and today we're studying one of the most turbulent times in human history, the French Revolution. Today, instead of discussing outraged mobs or Enlightenment principles, we're looking at a less sensational but equally powerful source for the chaos money. This question will particularly be looked at to what extent did the financial crisis in France eventually spark the French Revolution of 1789? Well, to make sense of this, we must first understand the economic crisis that was afflicting France before the revolution even began. France was greatly financially strained by the 1700s. France had spent large amounts on the war, specifically the Seven Years' War and in the American Revolution. They had borrowed so much that the interest on the debt alone took up half of the state's income. However, the system was grossly imbalanced. The poorest member of the society, like the peasants, had to pay the most, while the nobles and clergy contributed a little or nothing. As economist Francois Velde describes, persistent deficits were not just a result of bad planning. They arose from a political system that completely separated the privilege of spending from the obligation to pay taxes. This is significant since it pushes us beyond standard explanation of a revolution. Enlightenment principles of liberty and equality played a part, but it was the crowd who was money emptied, and the empty stomachs of the people that growled with hunger with which pushed things ahead. People didn't only starve for liberties, they starved for relief. Session 1: Tax System and Broken System. Even before the outbreak, the revolution, the financial system within France was disorganized. On the center of the stage was taxation. The poorest people, commoners and peasants belonging to the third estate, carried most of the burden, while the wealthiest nobility and clergy contributed little or nothing. According to Lillian Knowles, tax burdens fell with crushing weight upon the peasantry, while members of the privileged classes largely escaped the financial burden. But this was not purely a matter of inequality. It was a system that was unable to bring in enough revenue in order to function. The monarchy attempted to reform it in 1787 with the Assembly of Notables, hoping that the elites would consent to a new taxation. They would not. That failure directly resulted in the summoning of the States General in 1789, an act that unintentionally opened the door of the revolution. Historian Margaret C. Jacob explains how the financial crisis challenged to the political order by bringing social tension out into the open. This quote shows how the financial crisis did not just dismantle the monarchy, it exposed deep rooted inequalities long suppressed by the regime. When hardship reached the nation's peak in States General, discontent became political power. Individual complaints of the 30 states became demands of the public. The crisis did not just challenge authority, but it broke it and gave the public reason and space for rebellion. Session 2: From War to Bankruptcy. War spending and the spiral of debt, the revolution, was not just from inside France, it was also imported in terms of war. France had recently been in the War of Austrian Succession and the Seven Years' War, and most immediately, the American War of Independence. All the wars had been extremely expensive. France increasingly relied on borrowing, most notably by issuing life annuities, which obligated long term payments for immediate cash. Interest payments on France's debt absorbed over 50% of the government spending by 1788. This resulted in all the revenues of the states being directed towards loan repayments rather than citizens. Added on top of this was a lack of transparency. Finance Minister Jacques Necker published the Comte Rendou au Roi in 1781, in which he did not dishonestly declared a budget surplus. The report created the image of solution, but masked the fact of a deeply indebted monarchy. Once the truth was out, public confidence broke down. Debt was not just an economic issue; it was political. France's inability to tap the wealthy for funding and have to pay enormous wartime debt demonstrates how the government no longer had control over its own finances. Historian David Ware went on to tell how the government just kept borrowing money from retiring outstanding loans and the root problem was never touched. It went on to show that the monarchy no longer controlled their budget. Their finances were at the bottom of the pit and they lost public confidence. Lastly, they were unable to stop the nation from collapsing into the revolution. The image in the right shows the growth of France's national debt to 1740 and 1789. Section 3. Hunger turns to outrage. It was hardship that turned France's economic crisis into revolution. Prices for bread were up, wages were not, and household incomes were being taken as much as 80% by mere survival. Inflation, along with the crop failure, created extreme worrying conditions. In line, we learn from historian Bosengo that prices were much faster as that wages were rising, and bread rise were being encountered even prior to 1789. Hunger was now a nation's problem, rather than an individual problem. It was politicized in 1788. Tax accounts were burned, and grain warehouses were stormed by furious peasants. They were not just protesting unfair taxation, they were protesting for their right to survive. Townsmen were gossiping that nobles were hoarding grain or employing thieves to steal it. Factory workers in ruins smashed machinery, fearing that they would be displaced and starve. This wave of fear and rebellion became known as the Great Fear, and it demonstrated that economic disquiet has turned into political outrage. On the 14th of July 1789, there was the storming of the Bastille, that symbol of monarchical power and tyranny. It showed that the extent of fury, most importantly, it symbolized everything that the people hated in the monarchy: injustice, inequality, and inaction in the face of their misery. Even National Assembly deputies had to acknowledge that they were answering the demands of starving mobs as much as of the Enlightenment ideals. Hunger, rather than philosophy, was driving the call for reform. Here is where the link between revolution and economy is evident. It started in taxations and debts, but it ended with people starving and revolting. France did not fall because of ideas, it collapsed due to being unable to afford the goods. And for this reason, the financial crisis was not just a factor of a revolution, it created a revolution. Thus, in attempting to answer the question, how far did the French financial crisis actually spark the French Revolution of 1789? The facts demonstrate that it had an immense, inescapable effect. The crisis that lit the fuse. During session 1, we learned that the system of taxation was policy all but entire burden on the poorest citizens, while wealthy churchmen and nobles paid minimal or zero taxes. This inequality resulted in disillusionment and made it impossible for government to generate enough money in order to survive. In session 2, we were informed that France's war, especially the War of American Independence, had plunged the nation into debt. The monarchy had employed borrowing in its survival, but by 1788, even interest payments were taking up more than half of the budget. When the public were informed of how bad things actually were, there was a breakdown of confidence in the government. Finally, in session 3, we learned how the financial crisis turned into actual misery. Hunger, outrage, and fear swept the country. Tax accounts were set on fire by peasants, workers protested, and fall of Bastille. Oh my days, boy. But we also should mention what we didn't cover. While the show was mostly on economics, there was also hints of Enlightenment philosophy. political, and class resentment that needed to be mentioned. Also, we did not follow those paths as far as we could have. Many of the economic facts of the 1700s are also hard to pinpoint specifically. Still, the argument is clear. The economic the economic crisis did not merely spur on the revolution, but it was the spark that set it off. It was not hatched in books of philosophy, but in tax returns, register of debts, and empty bread baskets. Ah, just cooked. Now, thank you, everyone,